Welcome to White Shadows. These stories are from isolated and abandoned pit stops. Put on earphones, close your eyes, and enjoy the chills and thrills. So here goes the first tale. The sun was just beginning its descent, painting the arid Nevada desert in hues of gold and crimson. Alex and Beth had been on the road for hours, the hum of their car the only sound accompanying their journey through the vast emptiness. The desolate highway stretched endlessly, flanked by barren landscapes devoid of life. Beth, leaning against the passenger seat, glanced at the fuel gauge. "We're running low," she said, her voice laced with concern. Alex groaned. "Figures. Of course. There's nothing out here." As if summoned by their desperation, a flickering neon light appeared on the horizon. It was faint at first, a distant beacon in the middle of nowhere. As they got closer, the sign came into view. Restful Gas and Goods, open 24/7. The gas station stood alone under the darkening sky. Its weathered exterior hinted at decades of isolation, the peeling paint and rusted pumps whispering tales of abandonment. Yet, the lights inside were warm and inviting, an oasis amidst the desert's cold desolation. Alex pulled up beside one of the pumps. "Finally, let's fill up and get back on the road." Beth nodded, stepping out of the car to stretch her legs. She glanced around uneasily. The place was too quiet, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. "I'll grab snacks," she said, heading toward the station's entrance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. A single cashier stood behind the counter, his back turned. He was an odd figure, too tall, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to hang loosely from his frame. When he turned to face her, Beth froze. His eyes were deep-set and hollow, as if the sockets themselves stretched into an abyss. His lips curled into a grin that felt rehearsed, the corners stretching wider than they should. "Welcome," he drawled, his voice a monotone rasp. Beth forced a smile, grabbing a bag of chips and a soda. "Just these," she muttered, avoiding his gaze. The cashier's smile never wavered as he scanned her items. "Traveling far?" Yeah, just passing through." She fumbled for cash, her hands trembling slightly. "Be careful out there," he said as she turned to leave. His words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken warning. When Beth stepped outside, she saw Alex still struggling with the pump. He was visibly frustrated, muttering curses under his breath. "What's wrong?" she asked. "It's not working," Alex snapped. "The fuel gauge still says empty, but I've pumped gallons already." Beth glanced at the pump's display. It read $66.66. "That's weird," she murmured. Alex stormed into the station to complain, but he returned moments later, his face pale. "There's no one in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "I just talked to the cashier." Alex shook his head. "The place is empty, Beth, and it looks old, like it's been abandoned for years." A chill ran down her spine. She turned to look at the station. The lights inside flickered, revealing glimpses of decay. The walls were cracked, the shelves coated in dust. Yet, in the shadows, she swore she saw movement. "Let's leave," Beth said, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, but when he tried to start the car, it sputtered and died. The battery, which had been fine all day, was suddenly dead. Panic set in as they realized their phones had no signal. The payphone next to the station was disconnected, its cord frayed and swinging gently in the breeze. Then they saw him, the cashier. He was standing outside now, his grin even wider. His eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Need help?" he called out, his voice carrying an unnatural echo. Beth clutched Alex's arm. "We need to go. Now." Before they could move, more figures emerged from the shadows. They were grotesque, their bodies contorted and jerky as if controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were pale and featureless, except for those same wide, eerie grins. The couple bolted into the desert, their shoes kicking up sand as they ran. The figures followed, their movements unnervingly fast and fluid. The further Alex and Beth ran, the more disoriented they became. The landscape seemed to shift, the dunes rearranging themselves like a living maze. Eventually, they collapsed from exhaustion. Gasping for air, they dared to look back. The figures were gone, but so was the gas station. Relief turned to dread when they saw the neon sign flickering above them. Restful Gas and Goods, open 24/7. We didn't turn back, Alex stammered. Beth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. This isn't possible. Determined to escape, they tried walking in the opposite direction, only to find themselves back at the station once more. The cashier stood by the pumps, his grin impossibly wide. "You can't leave," he said, his voice reverberating through the air. "Not until the tank is full." Desperate, Alex grabbed the pump and began fueling again, even though the gauge remained stubbornly at empty. Beth screamed at him to stop, but he was in trance, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Hours turned into days. The sun never rose, and the station remained the only constant in an endless void. Alex continued fueling, his body withering from exhaustion, while Beth sat in the car, her mind unraveling. One day, Alex collapsed, the pump still in his hands. Beth, too weak to scream, watched as the cashier and his grotesque companions dragged Alex's lifeless body into the station. When they returned, they were carrying something or someone. It was Alex, but not as she remembered. His eyes were hollow, and his face was frozen in a wide, unnatural grin. He approached the car and knocked on the window. "Your turn," he said, his voice eerily cheerful. Beth refused, locking the doors and cowering in the back seat. But the cashier appeared beside her, his grin inches from her face. "You can't stay forever," he whispered. And then the doors unlocked themselves. The second story is a motel room called Room 8B. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the narrow road into a slick, treacherous path. Sarah squinted through the windshield as lightning illuminated the jagged peaks of the Scottish Highlands in the distance. The GPS on her phone had long since lost its signal, leaving her and her brother, Jamie, navigating blindly through the desolate terrain. "We should have just stayed in the last town," Jamie muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "We couldn't afford it," Sarah replied, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Let's just hope we find something soon." As if on cue, the headlights caught a weathered sign. Heather Haven. Cozy rooms, hot meals. Beneath the text, an arrow pointed to a side road that veered sharply off the main highway. "Cozy and hot sounds good to me," Jamie said, his mood lightening. The motel came into view after a few minutes. A squat, L-shaped building with flickering porch lights. It sat in isolation, surrounded by dark woods that seemed to press against the edges of the property. A single car was parked outside, its hood dusted with leaves as though it hadn't moved in weeks. Sarah parked the car, and they dashed through the rain to the reception office. The door creaked loudly as they stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy, carrying a faint odor of mildew and something else, something metallic. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with sharp, bird-like features. Her pale blue eyes tracked their movements as they approached. "Looking for a room?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yes," Sarah said. "Just for the night." The woman nodded and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, her gnarled fingers trembling slightly. "Rooms 7A and 9C are available." She hesitated before adding, "8B is off-limits." Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" The woman's lips thinned. "It's not safe. Stay away from it. That's all you need to know." Her cryptic warning sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, but she forced a polite smile. "We'll take 7A." As they made their way to the room, Jamie couldn't resist teasing. "Not safe? What do you think that means? Ghosts? Rats? A secret serial killer hideout? Can you not?" Sarah snapped. I'm exhausted and I don't want to think about it. The room was modest but clean, with 2 twin beds, a rickety nightstand, and faded floral wallpaper. A single window overlooked the parking lot, where the rain continued to pound against the glass. They were just beginning to settle in when it started. A faint knocking. At first, it was so soft that Sarah thought it was her imagination. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the shared wall with room 8B. "Must be someone next door," Jamie said, shrugging. Sarah frowned. She said it was off limits. So maybe someone ignored her. Big deal. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued for hours, the same steady rhythm, until it seemed to echo in their skulls. Unable to take it anymore, Sarah marched to the reception desk. The old woman looked up from her knitting with an expression of mild surprise. "Something wrong?" "There's someone in 8B, Sarah said. "They've been knocking on the wall all night." The woman's face darkened. "No one is in 8B. That room hasn't been used in decades." "What are you talking about?" Sarah paused, her voice faltering under the woman's intense gaze. "It's cursed," the woman said firmly. "No one goes in. No one stays next door. If you value your life, stay in your room and don't look inside." A wave of dread washed over Sarah as she returned to 7A. She found Jamie standing by the wall, his ear pressed against it. "It's not just knocking," he whispered. "I can hear whispers too. It's like they're calling for help." "Stop listening to it," Sarah snapped, yanking him away. But the whispers grew louder as the night dragged on, filling the room with an unnatural sense of dread. At midnight, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. Jamie, ever the curious one, couldn't resist. He grabbed a flashlight from his bag and gestured for Sarah to follow him. "We need to see what's in there," he said. "You're insane," Sarah hissed. "Didn't you hear what she said?" Jamie rolled his eyes. "It's probably just an old, creepy room. Nothing's going to happen." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him to room 8B. The door was locked, but Jamie crouched down to peer through the keyhole. "What do you see?" Sarah whispered. "There's a woman," Jamie said, his voice shaky. "She's standing in the corner, staring at the wall." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Let's go." But Jamie didn't move. He kept staring, his face growing paler by the second. "Jamie, stop!" Sarah yanked him away and looked through the keyhole herself. But all she saw was darkness, pitch black, as if someone had painted over the lens. Suddenly, the door creaked open. The room inside was pristine, frozen in time. The bed was perfectly made, the furniture gleaming as if freshly polished. But the air was icy cold, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness hung in the space. In the corner stood a woman in a tattered white dress, her back turned to them, her long, matted hair draped over her shoulders. "Leave," she whispered. Jamie took a step forward, as if compelled. "Jamie, no!" Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The woman turned, her face a grotesque mask of decay and rage. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah, and her mouth stretched into a scream that wasn't human. The lights in the hallway flickered violently, plunging everything into darkness. Sarah felt Jamie's hand slip from hers, and when the lights returned, he was gone. She ran back to the reception desk, sobbing and screaming for help, but the old woman was nowhere to be found. The motel looked different now, older, covered in dust and cobwebs. Desperate, Sarah returned to room 8B, but it was locked again. She banged on the door, screaming Jamie's name until she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw him, or what looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes empty, and his lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile. "Let's go, Sarah," he said softly. She backed away, shaking her head. "You're not him." The figure tilted its head, the smile growing wider. "You're right," it whispered. The last thing Sarah saw before the door to 8B swung open and pulled her inside was the neon motel sign flickering in the rain. The next morning, the motel stood silent and empty. A new sign on the desk read, "Rooms available, 7A, 8B, 9C." The last story is of Isolated in, ready to feel the chills in your bones. So here it goes. The road was a thread of darkness, unspooling endlessly before their car. Josh and Emily had been driving for hours through the winding forests of Eastern Europe, the dense trees swallowing any trace of moonlight. The old paper map on Emily's lap was useless now, smudged and torn from years of use. "Are we even going the right way?" Emily asked, her voice tense. Josh gripped the wheel tighter. "We don't have much choice, do we? It's this or spend the night in the car." As if in answer to their plight, the headlights caught a sign at the side of the road. The words were barely legible, faded with age. "Dead man's in warm beds, hot suppers." "Dead man's in?" Emily echoed, her tone dubious. Josh laughed nervously. "Just a name. Let's check it out." The inn came into view moments later, a hulking structure that seemed to sag under its own weight. The wood was dark and rotting, with ivy creeping up its sides like skeletal fingers. A faint orange glow emanated from the windows, and the faint scent of roasted meat wafted through the air. "It's inviting," Emily said hesitantly, though her instinct screamed otherwise. Josh parked the car, and they stepped out into the chilly night. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The inn's front door creaked open before they could reach it, revealing a man standing in the dim light. "Welcome," he said with a wide, toothy grin. His accent was thick, his voice almost musical. Come in. You must be cold." Josh and Emily exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The interior was warmer than expected, lit by flickering candelabras. The walls were adorned with faded paintings of stern-looking people, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. "I'm Victor," the man said, shutting the door behind him. "You're in luck. Tonight is our monthly feast. You'll eat like kings." Josh's stomach growled at the mention of food, and Emily smiled politely, though unease prickled at the back of her neck. "We just need a room for the night," Josh said. "Of course," Victor replied. "But first, you must join us. It's tradition." He led them down a narrow hallway into a grand dining room. A long table stretched across the space, laden with platters of steaming food, roasted meats, golden breads, and exotic fruits that glistened in the candlelight. The aroma was intoxicating, making Emily's mouth water despite her apprehension. The table was surrounded by guests, all impeccably dressed. They turned to greet Josh and Emily with broad smiles, their eyes unnaturally bright. "New friends," a woman exclaimed, her voice high and lilting. Victor pulled out chairs for them at the table. "Sit, eat, enjoy." Josh didn't need convincing. He piled his plate high, eagerly digging into the food. Emily, however, hesitated. The guests were off. Their movements were too fluid, their laughter too synchronized, and their faces, though flawless, seemed almost waxy in the flickering light. "Emily, you've got to try this," Josh said through a mouthful of meat. She forced a smile and picked at her plate, though the food no longer seemed appetizing. The conversation around the table was lively, but strange. Stories of travels and adventures that seemed to belong to another era. "How long have you all been staying here?" Emily asked one of the women beside her. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "Oh, we never leave." Before Emily could respond, Victor clinked his glass with a fork. "Attention, friends. It's time for the toast." The guests raised their glasses, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide. Victor's eyes gleamed as he addressed the room. "To new beginnings. To eternal fellowship." As everyone drank, Emily noticed something horrifying. The wine in their glasses was thick and dark, like blood. She gagged. pushing her glass away. "Not a fan?" Victor asked, his tone deceptively casual. Josh was already reaching for Emily's untouched glass. "If you're not drinking it, I will." "No." Emily slapped his hand away, spilling the contents onto the table. The liquid hissed and bubbled where it landed, eating through the wood like acid. The room fell silent. Every guest turned to stare at her, their smiles gone, replaced by expressions of cold malice. Victor leaned closer, his face inches from Emily's. "We don't waste here," he said softly, his voice dripping with menace. Josh stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What the hell is going on?" Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. Emily grabbed Josh's arm. "We need to leave. Now." They stumbled out of the dining room and into the hallway, the distant sound of laughter echoing behind them. The once warm and was now freezing, the air thick with the stench of rot. "Where's the exit?" Josh whispered, his voice trembling. Emily's heart pounded as they turned corner after corner, only to find themselves back in the same hallway. The paintings on the walls had changed. The stern figures were now grinning, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. I don't understand," Emily stammered. Suddenly, a door slammed open behind them. Victor stood in the doorway, his face twisted into something monstrous. His skin was gray and cracked, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You can't leave," he snarled. "You're part of the feast now." Josh grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and swung it at Victor, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he lunged, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Emily screamed, pulling Josh down a side hallway. They burst into the kitchen, where the smell of decay was overpowering. Large pots bubbled on the stove, their contents unidentifiable but grotesque. In the corner, Emily saw something that made her stomach drop. A pile of bones. Human bones. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind them. Desperate, they pushed through another door, finding themselves back in the dining room. The table was empty now, except for 2 plates, each holding a slab of meat that looked disturbingly human. The guests surrounded them, their perfect faces now warped and grotesque. Victor stepped forward, holding a goblet of the dark liquid. "Drink," he commanded, "or join the feast another way." Josh and Emily screamed as the guests closed in, their laughter echoing through the inn like the wails of the damned. The next morning, the inn was silent. The table was set again with 2 new chairs added at the end. Victor stood at the door, smiling as a new car pulled into the driveway.